Appreciate it. So hi, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm the Maddie's Fund Research Fellow at Arizona State University. I'm in the Canine Science Collaboratory, so our work focuses on dogs and their wild relatives. And my work specifically takes a look at dogs living in animal shelters. So like Rachel said, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. Hopefully it'll make it a little bit more interesting, but no promises. So anyway, let's get started. So since this is sort of an international audience, I wanted to talk a little bit about the situation in the US with dogs and with dogs living in homes, and then also those in animal shelters. So it's been estimated that there's about 78 million dogs that live in the US. That's from the APPA, which likely overestimates a bit, but that's sort of the general sort of number of dogs living in homes. And at like last survey, which was almost 10 years ago, we see that about 20% of dogs were adopted from animal shelters. And it's likely that that number is increasing, particularly when we consider the reduction in the number of purebred dogs in the US that are being registered to places like the AKC. So each year, again, these are just estimates, about 5.5 million dogs will enter one of about 7,000 animal shelters in the US. And so we have a lot of dogs coming into shelters, and the sort of situation of dogs in shelters has changed quite a bit over the past 20 years. We look at like the late 90s and early 2000s when some of this work was first beginning in animal shelters, research in animal shelters, and likely dogs would stay in the shelter for about 10 days. And then at that point, they would have either been adopted, returned to their owner, or euthanized. And so today, looking now into 2020, we find that most dogs are going to be adopted or returned to shelters, and about 15, or returned to their owners, and about 15% of dogs that enter the shelter will be euthanized. So that's the sort of situation. And we have sort of, questions about how we can improve the welfare of dogs while they're living in shelters and awaiting that outcome. And so there's a variety, when we consider the life of a dog in the shelter, there's a variety of potential stressors that could negatively impact their welfare. And so if we kind of think about what things could be most impactful, I think one thing that us humans are sensitive to is the noise in the shelter. And so we find through a series of studies, and likely this sort of stressor or potential stressor, excessive noise, is probably one of the most well studied in the shelter. And we see that noise levels can range anywhere from about 65 decibels to 125. And here in the US, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration says that humans for 8 hours shouldn't have their ears unprotected if those decibels are above 90. And so the fact that some dogs are experiencing 125 decibels, remembering that decibels aren't linear, but they're logarithmic, that could be pretty impactful. And in fact, in a particular study by Sheffield in 2012, they found that a small cohort of dogs that they measured their hearing, and then measured that their hearing 6 months later, they actually found that there was hearing loss with that prolonged exposure. Additionally, when we consider this guy here in his kennel, we have to consider that likely the kennel, reduces dogs' space, and that likely then reduces their ability to kind of engage in species typical behaviors, which again, it can be impactful for welfare. One kind of aspect of stress in the shelter, or potential stress in the shelter, that our lab is interested in is this idea of social isolation, or the converse, social interaction. So in the shelter, dogs often don't have a lot of contact with other dogs. They may be all around them, but not necessarily interacting with them, and as well as people. If we think of the singly housed dog in an animal shelter, it would probably be a pretty progressive shelter if the dogs were spending just a couple hours a day out of their kennel. But that does leave over 20 and some plus hours a day that they're on their own. And some shelters do co-house, and we'll talk more about that because that's sort of something we're interested in. But oftentimes that can be limited due to worries about aggression between the dogs and also disease transmission. So what are other things that could potentially impact the dogs? For those dogs that are coming directly from homes and their owner is surrendering them at the shelter, some work by Hibby, Rooney and Bradshaw back in 2006 identified a potential effect of that status of owner surrender on increasing cortisol levels on entry. So a different sort of slope to those cortisol values when first coming into the shelter, suggesting that perhaps how they come into the shelter, whether they're an owner surrendered dog, whether they're a stray, perhaps even a cruelty confiscate case, that could lead to different trajectories when dogs first enter the animal shelter. And I think something that's probably maybe not as evident as things like social isolation or spatial restrictions, we have the dogs experiencing a lack of control and predictability. So the predictability piece kind of makes sense, right? It's the routine thing. And really the one thing that dogs can often anticipate on a schedule in the shelter is being fed. And there's often a lot of excitement around that. Dogs barking, dogs becoming very excited at the anticipation of their feeding time. But in a home, it's a bit different, right? That we are likely on a schedule that we leave the house every day, we come back at a certain time, we walk them, we spend time with them, we feed them. So there's likely a bit more predictability in their lives when being an owned dog than being in the shelter. But this lack of control, I think, is something that we should certainly consider. So when we again consider the pup here in this photograph, and he looks like he has this anticipatory response, hopefully to a person walking by. And if we think that, in fact, yes, he does like people, and he's, his body is loose and his eyes are soft and he's interested in interacting and he's approaching. Those are sort of things that in real life, without the bars, without the kennel, that he could likely approach somebody and do all of those gestures or that body language, and it would result in petting from a person. But in the animal shelter, it doesn't quite work that way. They can do those same moves that they learned outside of the shelter, but when they try it with a person walking by, it's possible that they're likely just going to keep on walking if they're not interested in adopting that dog. And so kind of considering how that lack of control can lead to what Deborah Wells has considered an apathy-like behavior when these previous sort of behaviors don't result in that sort of outcome of interaction. So I think all of these sort of pieces of this sort of puzzle are important to consider, because if shelters are attempting to save the lives of more animals, it's likely that dogs are going to be hanging out in the shelter to maybe overcome medical issues, to overcome behavioral issues. And so the shelter is no longer this temporary port in the storm, but it's kind of more like an orphanage, where we really do need to be considering what is the daily life of the dog, that sort of proximate welfare, and how we can improve it. Any questions on that? Looks like we're good. Yeah. Okay. So,
we have one question.
Oh yeah, I love it.
Woohoo! All right, thank you for the very informative and meaningful talk. You mentioned earlier noise as the major welfare concern. I'm wondering what type, this is from Jen. She's wondering what types of noises are commonly perceived in shelters, dog barking or more human-made noise.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And as far as I know, there really hasn't been a parsing out yet of things like, say, dogs barking, and what about like HVAC systems and how they can kick on and off, or air conditioning. And then also any sort of noise of people talking, walking by, being adjacent and working near the dogs. And so I think that's a great question, because it may be possible that, that noises of talking and being around people for some dogs may be perceived more positively. But yeah, I think that's a great question, and I don't think we know the answer to it just yet. Awesome. Okay, so what do we know then about this shelter, and is it actually stressful? I just mentioned these potential stressors, right? But we know that kind of the individual's experience, can be different. So what work has been done to try to understand how about the stress in the shelter? And so we see that oftentimes trying to understand this idea of stress comes through using various measures of cortisol. And it's probably, within the dog literature, probably one of the most widely used physiological markers of stress. And so when previous work has taken a look at, say, for example, differences between owned dogs and shelter dogs in their cortisol levels, they find that, in fact, yes, dogs living in the shelter have higher levels of cortisol, particularly upon entry, than dogs living in homes. But we could certainly say that, well, perhaps these dogs are just different, populations of dogs, in fact, and they're different. And so does that sort of between measures study really get at the question? But when we in fact take a look at the same dog, so now within subjects design, where we're measuring the cortisol levels of dogs in a home, and then they're placed in a kennel situation, which Rooney, Gaines, and Bradshaw did back in 2007. They were fostering dogs and then putting them in a kennel for additional training. They found a threefold increase in cortisol when the dogs entered the kennels. So it seems to suggest that, in fact, coming into the shelter is stressful for the dogs, differing amounts of time, perhaps for different types of dogs coming in, but it is likely a stressful experience. So then what can we do to improve welfare for dogs in shelters if we know that that is in fact compromised? And so we see that human interaction is probably one of the most well-studied interventions in animal sheltering, seen by the references here. And in fact, it kind of doesn't matter what you do. That you can be petting the dog, you can be playing with the dog, you can just be present in the room, but that human interaction between the person and the dog improves welfare when compared to just remaining in the kennel or even being removed from the kennel, but there's not a person present. So I'll first talk about a little bit of work that we've done on the human interaction piece before we move on to the housing and dog interaction piece, because I think that they inform each other a bit about why we've been asking the questions that we do. So I'll talk briefly about two different studies that we've done. One is on temporary fostering, and the other is on short-term outings. And so this first study, taking a look at temporary fostering, or sleepovers as we call them, was previously published in Peer J last year. And actually, I presented this data at ISAE in Norway. So this is like kind of the first part of the story. But taking a look at this idea of temporary fostering, we wanted to explore the idea of the dogs leaving the shelter for a couple of nights, and how their cortisol levels differed from before the sleepover and after. And so to go about doing that, we collected urine from the dogs. We've collected a lot of urine from dogs. I'm going to be talking about a lot of urine samples today, but we collect urine samples to measure for cortisol. And typically we use urine. I'll be talking about a later study that we've used feces, but we're typically looking at urine and feces because it's less stressful than collecting blood, and even saliva. We found saliva can be a bit challenging for shelter dogs sometimes. So we collected urine, and whoops. There we go. And so for this first study, I'll be talking about the sleepovers. We looked at three different time points. We looked at before the sleepover, during the sleepover, and after the sleepover. And so that resulted in 6 different time points for our sleepovers. And then I'm also going to talk about field trips, which we have 5 time points on the field trips. And so the idea here too is that we're collecting at the same time. There's been some talk about whether or not urinary cortisol can fluctuate over the day. And so we'll be talking in the sleepover study. We collected these measures in the morning between 7 and 9:30 each morning. So taking a look then first at our sleepover question, does 2 nights away improve the welfare of the dogs as measured by the cortisol levels? We have our graph here, and on the x-axis we have before, during, and after the sleepover aggregated. I'll break them apart so we can see them across the 6 different time points. And then on the y-axis we have the dog's cortisol to creatinine ratios. And so in taking a look at this data, it's represented with 5 different shelters here. And so we have 40 dogs at each shelter. We have 2 time points before, 2 time points during, and 2 time points after. And so what we see here is that before the dog's cortisol levels on average across all of our shelters is right around 30, and that it drops during the sleepover by about 5 points or so, and that is statistically significant. And then the dogs, when they come back to the shelter, we see that their cortisol levels increase, but no higher than before they left. And when we pull across from our shelters here across the 6 different time points, we have here 4 different shelters represented. Our shelter partners at Arizona Humane, Humane Society of Western Montana, a shelter in Atlanta, and another shelter in Texas. And we see that our shelter here in Arizona, they demonstrate some of the highest cortisol levels. But we see that while the levels are higher during that day 1 and 2, they drop significantly on day 3 and 4. And rise back up on those last days 5 and 6. So we see a nice shape here of an effect of our intervention. And when we take a look at our other sites that we ran the study, we see a similar kind of effect or trend, although the magnitude of the intervention is smaller, suggesting that perhaps like where the dogs start, starting levels in the shelter could have an impact of that sort of effect of the intervention. But we see that overall, these shelters, despite their differences, so the shelter, for example, Humane Society of Western Montana, sees only about 600 dogs a year. So their volume of dogs and number of dogs in their facility at one time is quite low, whereas the shelter in Atlanta, DCAS, DeKalb County, they see 6,000 dogs a year, and often have 100 to 200 dogs on site at any one time. And so we see that kind of irrespective of the shelter, we see an effect of the intervention, but that magnitude of the intervention is different. So any questions on that?
How many dogs did you have for each shelter?
Oh, that's a great question. So we have 40 dogs at each shelter. And this is also accounting for, also I want to mention, it accounts for their age, it accounts for their weight, because we have found differences in dogs' cortisol levels based on age and weight. And so this is sort of our first study taking a look at this idea of sleepovers, the dogs leaving for 2 nights. But here, this is proving to be exciting.
Yes, I am trying to read as we go.
Oh yeah, thanks for that.
This should be muted, and then we have one more question. So from Angeli, she was wondering how many dogs you measured per shelter, and which you answered, and then if there were any individual differences between them. So some that were better with coping with the sleepover than others.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing to remember in any of this data is that we are looking at averages. And I think that, we have a wide range of dogs that participate. Basically, our sort of criteria was that we could, walk you on leash, and we could collect urine. Sometimes dogs were a little too worried. We were pretty stealthy. We got pretty good at it. This data set represents, I think, over 1,000 urine samples. But that could be a concern. And also dogs that were aggressive, we wouldn't enroll them. But oftentimes, though, if we could stay safe with the dogs, we were enrolling them. But I think within that sort of broadness, we have a lot of different sort of temperament or personality types of the dogs. And certainly this intervention could work differently for different dogs. When we talk to shelters, I think one conversation we have is, right, this is on average, this should likely benefit the dogs, but if there are certain qualities about the dog that you think may impact the dog leaving the shelter, and how beneficial or restful it might be to be in be in a new person's home, that should certainly be taken into consideration. So then, any other questions?
I had one last one.
Oh, yeah, I
For
love it.
urine collection, how did you do, like what methods did you use?
Oh, this is great. We love talking about this. I could talk all day about this. Um, so, uh, so how did we capture the urine? So we fashioned these, like those sticks. Well, they're called like grab and reach. They're like, you use them to grip things and take things off of shelves. We used those because they're very lightweight, and then we would attach a collection, like a veterinary collection plate, onto that gripper inside that, so we could slide it very easily under the dogs, and collect their urine. So that's how we did it. And then we would pour it into the vial, and then freeze it as soon as we could get back to inside the animal shelter. So
And then one question from the chat that just popped up.
yeah.
Is it possible that during the sleepover, the activity level was generally lower as they're in a more unfamiliar environment, and then therefore the lower cortisol?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. So I know I should have just provided like more slides on this. I like put it together, and then and then folks are asking and I'm like, oh wait, I just wanted to just briefly mention it. But yeah, absolutely. We did take a look at their activity, and I'll show you an analysis. When I show you the field trip analysis, which is up next, we actually accounted for their activity in the analysis. But in this one, we also analyzed it. And what we found is that dogs, what we called longest bout of uninterrupted rest, so that's resting for consecutive minutes, we found it was lower when the dogs were in the shelter. And it was significantly higher when they were out on that sleepover, exactly like the person that asked the question hypothesized. And then the nice thing we found, though, is that when they actually returned from the sleepover, we found that their longest bouts of rest were still longer than before, when they were in the shelter before. So seeming to suggest that there was kind of a carryover effect of that sort of resting when they returned to the shelter, which lined up with sort of anecdotal reports from shelter staff that the dogs were like less agitated, less kind of antsy, and they were laying down more and sleeping and resting in their kennels.
And with that question, we had a follow-up from Stephanie, and she asked, were the short-term foster families given any specific directions with as regards to specifically their behavior? So how much to let the dog relax or decompress without much interaction versus how much interaction an active player walks to engage the dog in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's something that we can kind of talk about now that we sort of have the sleepover data and we have our field trip data. So in the sleepover data, the folks were often just going back to their homes. They had the dogs for 2 nights. They were certainly welcome to walk the dogs, to go around town. That was certainly allowed for. But what we found, based on how much rest that they were getting, is that likely they were not as active as what we found on the field trips. We encouraged folks that would do the field trips, which I'll just pull up that now. With the field trips, we encourage them to do a variety of different activities. But what we found, and you can see in the data here, is that unlike the sleepovers, where the dogs were resting more when they were away and had lower cortisol, when we look at the field trips, we see actually an opposite sort of effect. So those 2.5 hours away, which is what this field trip represents, we find, in fact, that their cortisol increases, and that is related to it. That does account for the additional activity and reduced rest that we found. So we accounted for that in this second analysis, or this analysis on the field trips. Hopefully that answers the question. Did that answer the question, Rachel? I hope so.
I think so.
Oh, good. Okay. Anything else?
Oh, and Stephanie confirmed it did, and thank you.
I love that. I love that positive reinforcement. Thank you, Stephanie.
There's a lot of thank yous in the chat.
Okay,
So I think you're ready to continue on.
awesome, thank you. So, so seeing like the benefits of those 2 nights out of the shelter, we thought, well, you know, this other idea of field trips, right? The dogs leaving for a couple of hours, does that confer the same benefits to the dogs? Because certainly that's a shorter period of time. And so, so this data that I'll be showing here represents 4 different shelters that we worked with last summer, and they implemented a 2.5-hour outing program. So the dogs would leave the shelter and go away for 2.5 hours and come back, and we measured their cortisol before in the shelter, during that, or directly after that field trip, and then the next day. And what we found is that unlike sleepovers, we actually find that the dog's cortisol increases when they're away for those 2.5 hours. So when we kind of dig into that a little bit deeper, so we have 4 different shelters here, a shelter in Washington, another shelter in Virginia, another shelter in Georgia, and a shelter in Michigan and Detroit. And so the design of this study is a little bit different, and I just kind of wanted to walk folks through this because we see that we're looking again at before, during, and after, but the time course is much smaller because we're looking at an intervention of just 2.5 hours. So when we're looking at an intervention of just 2.5 hours, it does require us to look at the afternoon and morning before, that afternoon directly after the field trip, which is hopefully reflecting back upon, if we think about that sort of reflection period of urinary cortisol being 2 to 4 hours, that third time point, that day 2 afternoon, is reflecting back on that field trip. And then we have the morning and afternoon of day 3. And what we see here is that if we can kind of take a look at this data kind of 2 different ways, I think what's probably most informative beyond just the shape of the data is that we take a look at those afternoons. So that afternoon of day 1, that afternoon of day 2, and that afternoon of day 3. And remember that this data here is accounting for the activity of the dogs, not just like the lower activity, but also higher activity as well. Because when we first were analyzing this data and just looking at the cortisol before we accounted for activity, that was certainly a thought of ours, is this just related to the increased activity and decreased rest? But in fact, when we account for the proportion of time that they spent, so each one of these data points again represents 40 dogs at each of our shelters. We also had the dogs wearing accelerometers, and so we accounted for the 4 hours of activity of the dogs prior to that urine collection. And so we see that even when accounting for activity, we find that when compared to the afternoon before going on the field trip, the dogs' cortisol levels increase, but they do return to those sort of baseline levels mostly when they come back or when they're back in the shelter that following day. Any questions on that? I see like that red dot in the chat and I'm like, oh, okay, good. So one of the things that I want to mention is that taking a look at sort of the magnitude of the sort of effect of these interventions, that oftentimes maybe we see an increase of somewhere between like maybe 5 to 7. But when we take a look across all the shelters so far that have participated in this work, and we're kind of able to at least compare those because it's the same research team using the same methods across all these different shelters, we started seeing something sort of interesting. And that is like, right, we have 9 different shelters represented here. So this is from our first study on the sleepovers, and this is from our second study on field trips. We see quite a bit of variability between the shelters. And in fact, these differences are sometimes larger than the interventions that we were testing. So it had us wondering, is it possible that there are these unstudied factors in the shelter, maybe the density of the dogs in the ward in which the dogs are living, or the kennel size, or just the husbandry practices the dogs are receiving in the shelter, not leaving the shelter and going out, but actually what's occurring in the shelter? are those influencing welfare at all? So we set out to understand a bit more about the effects of housing and canine interaction this time on dogs living in the animal shelter. So what do we know sort of about the effects of dog interaction for dogs living in shelters? So this isn't laboratory dogs or colony dogs, but specifically pet dogs living in animal shelters. And so there isn't much work, but some older work from Petra Martins back in the mid-90s, they found that group house dogs that were, again, living together, sometimes in groups as large as 30. So this is quite a bit different than shelters here in the US, which I definitely want to point out. They found that group house dogs were less noisy than singly housed dogs in the shelter. And when they compared the two groups of dogs on stereotypic behaviors, so things like spinning or tail chasing, they found that there were they observed no stereotypic behaviors with the group house dogs, and about 10% of the singly house dogs had some sort of stereotypy, suggesting that perhaps kenneling with another dog could be beneficial. And some more recent work by Walker in 2014 took a look at the effects of when we pair house dogs in the shelter, and then one of those dogs is removed. What sort of effects on welfare does that have for the remaining dog? And they found that that dog that was remaining after its conspecific was removed, and this was usually after the dogs were living together for a couple of months, they found that the remaining dog showed increased running, pacing, stretching, and grooming in the kennel, and also had elevated immune function antibodies. So with that in mind, we were thinking, okay, we're accounting for the activity of the dogs, the rest and the higher activity. We're measuring the dog's cortisol levels. Could we perhaps incorporate another measure of welfare to understand what the dogs are experiencing in the shelter? And so based on, like, you had some of that work by Walker, we thought, we became curious because unlike sort of, measuring cortisol, SIGA, secretory immunoglobulin A, is likely less sensitive to arousal, and it kind of can improve our ability to detect these physiological effects of those potential stressors that I mentioned before. And in fact, when Walker and colleagues took a look at the SIGA levels of those dogs after separation, they found that yes, it increased, but cortisol remained unaffected. So there is perhaps something else that SIGA is able to measure perhaps differently than cortisol. So we wanted to include that in our dependent measures. So earlier last year, we were approached by a shelter in Minnesota who had built these novel kennel design, this novel sort of kennel housing, and you can see here that the housing consists of six suites or dens that the dogs live in, and they are glass fronted. Their doors go all the way to the ceiling. They have individual HVAC for each individual kennel of the dogs. And so there's kind of sort of two components of this housing that we were interested in. There is the actual physical housing itself. Like I said, there's 6 dogs living in these kennels. But then there's also this interaction component to how the shelter built these kennels. So you can see on that photo on the bottom left that you can see the 6 different kennels that the dogs are living in. But then there's this area out in front of those kennels, and that's where dogs are allowed to interact during the day. So we thought that this sort of housing had some interesting sort of components that we thought could be interesting to test to see, in fact, if they are making a difference in the dog's welfare. So how did we go about then testing this idea of housing, different housing, and the social contact with other dogs? So we tested dogs in 2 different types of housing, and this is within subjects design. So all dogs experienced the kenneling situations. And on the top, we have this traditional housing. So you can see that it's barred front versus glass. It's tiled similarly to there's a different type of tiling, but it's still tiled. And then it has bars and it doesn't go all the way to the top. And those kennels, as you can see, versus that novel type housing on the bottom is a little bit bigger. So we have a couple different differences there that could be an effect. We were in the midst of testing this in March when we had to come home. So I don't quite know. We had various ideas about what could be contributing, but we'll have to save that for another time. So we have these different housings, and then we have social contacts. So to test this sort of effect of the dogs being able to interact with each other outside of their kennel, we looked at prescribed times out of the kennel, 15 minutes a day, 3 times a day. And so those interactions happened at the same time each day. And we used as minimal sort of punishment as possible with the dogs. Most often we were reinforcing the dogs with food and managing the dogs if they didn't enjoy interacting with another dog. We kept the groups anywhere from 2 to 4 dogs, depending on how well they were getting along. Yeah, so let's see, I'll kind of dig into more about the design in case folks have questions. So when we consider then the 4 different groups that we have that we're testing in the study, we're taking a look at dogs that were living in these traditional type kennels that were receiving social interaction or not, and then dogs that were living in this novel sort of housing and then receiving social contact or not. So then our sort of procedure is that we had 2 cohorts of dogs, 6 dogs in each cohort, and they were in each one of these conditions for 3 days. So for a total of 12 days of enrollment. And so what we're testing here is we're looking at a main effect of housing, a main effect of that social contact or social interaction. And then this is why we say, I'm careful about how to say interaction, and I just blew it. But, and then looking at that interaction of housing and social contact. So the 2 main effects and then that interaction. And what I'll be showing today is the effects on fecal cortisol and SIGA. So any questions on that before I dive into the results? Just want to make sure the design's clear to everyone. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, I'll proceed forth. All right. So then let's take a look then at first these sort of main effects. So when we take a look at housing, we see a significant difference in the dog's SIGA levels. That in fact, dogs in the traditional housing actually have lower SIGA than dogs in novel housing. And for folks out there that that use SIGA in their own work, I think that there certainly is some sort of question about how to perceive differences in SIGA, but in terms of on the short term, so remembering that these dogs are experiencing each condition for 3 days, so this isn't looking necessarily at chronic stress over several weeks or months, we can interpret this likely that the traditional housing is conferring a benefit to the dogs as opposed to the novel housing. Now remember, this is collapsing on the main effect. So this is incorporating both types of social contact with the dogs. And then when we take a look at social contact, we see that looking at the dog's SIGA values, and in fact, the social condition interacting with other dogs that 3 times a day for 15 minutes reduce dogs' SIGA levels as opposed to not receiving any social contact. But then when we take a look at the dog's cortisol levels, it's a bit more complicated of a story. So we see here, in fact, that yes, there is an interaction, but let's take a look then at the 2 different housing and the contact. So we see that here with this data, that in fact, when we take a look at the dogs receiving social contact in the novel condition, receiving no social contact in the novel condition, that those dogs have the highest cortisol levels. And conversely, when dogs are receiving social contact in that novel condition, it's just about the same as dogs that were in the traditional housing not receiving any social contact. So we see sort of a different story here, that the housing sort of different types of housing confer different benefits, and that the social contact doesn't necessarily work the same in these different types of housing. So what are then the sort of takeaways then of this story so far? Well, we can likely say that this traditional housing is probably less stressful than maybe we previously perceived when we consider dog density. And I think that this is something important to consider, because we controlled for this in our design. When we first started working with this with Animal Humane in Minnesota, that's the shelter we're working with. You know, the thought was, oh, perhaps the sort of comparison would be the other adoptable kennels. But I think one thing to consider when we're looking at different housing is that different housing, in fact, the other adoptable kennels was in like a warehouse type state, right, where there were several dogs, probably 50 to 60 dogs living together in individual kennels, but all within one ward. So when we look at the different types of housing, I think we do need to consider that there are the same amount of dogs living in both spaces, in case that has some sort of provides some sort of difference to the dogs. So I think that overall we can say that, at least with when we compare this, just again, main effect of the traditional housing versus these novel kennels, that they were in fact less stressful, and that manage social interactions with other dogs, at least in the way in which they were carried out. So dogs were able to interact with each other, dogs received food from people were present, providing positive reinforcement to the dogs, and managing interactions so that there were very few, if any, fights, seemed to benefit the dogs. And then lastly, that kind of counter to our sort of ideas going into this study, that the novel shelter housing, without that social interaction piece, was likely the most detrimental for the dog's welfare. So I think just sort of when we consider the housing of dogs in shelters, there are some challenges with the viewability of the dogs, right? Making sure that they're available for people to be seen, so that they can be adopted, and also perhaps what type of housing is most beneficial to the dogs. So with that, I want to thank my collaborators, Clive Land, Rachel Gilchrist, and Emily Blade here at Arizona State University. Also, our collaborators, Erica Fierbacher and Joanna Platzer at Virginia Tech. We have plenty of shelter partners, and we could not do this work without them, and also our funder, Maddie's. So with that, I'll take questions.
Our first question in the chat is, did you record any behavioral measures in addition to the physiological measures, such as aggression, agonism, fear, positive behavioral welfare indicators?
Yes, so that's some previous work that I did in my dissertation, looking at behavioral indicators of welfare as related to physiology. In this study, we did videotape the dogs in that social contact condition, and we are looking at their behavior amongst the dogs and how that's related to their various physiological measures. So and activity. So my take home on that is stay tuned. We'll have more about at least the interaction piece with the other dogs and how that relates to those differences in cortisol and SIGA.
We have another question, or two actually new questions. So the first question is, how are dogs usually housed in U.S. shelters? So would that be individually?
Yeah.
Yes.
I would say often. I would say the majority of dogs are singly housed.
And then which advantages was novel shelter housing expected to bring to the dogs? And then
Yeah.
he said it seems like it would be more detrimental.
Yeah, no, this is great. So yeah, I think it is sort of interesting. I think that if we look at like the distribution, just to talk a little bit more on the housing piece in the US, I think you see a distribution is that probably like shelters that are not as well funded are kenneling the dogs together. And then, but then you have smaller shelters or more well-resourced shelters, and they're likely kenneling singly. So I'd say overall, I would say if we looked across all shelters, we'd probably see that a majority are singly housed. And then there's a wide difference in the number of dogs that can be kenneled together. So, and that was something, in fact, that taking a look at that Lifeline data and perhaps what was contributing to why their sort of shape of their data was a little bit different than our other shelters. One reason that we thought may be contributing to that is that they group house dogs anywhere from like sometimes upwards of 6 to even 8 dogs in a kennel. And so, so with that in mind, perhaps leaving the kennel for a couple of hours and then coming back might be quite a bit different because they have to integrate back into the group. And if they had overall sort of habituated to the kind of multiple dogs and their personalities in the kennel, leaving and coming back may have actually been a bit stressful for the dogs. One explanation, not to say it's the explanation, but could be. So let's see. I have to look at the question to make sure. Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think that this is the sort of interesting. I agree with the point about the novel housing being detrimental. Absolutely. We were brought in to sort of measure the effects of this housing because unfortunately, it wasn't really designed with behavior and welfare in mind. If you were to take a look, for example, at the size of the kennels, that was just because they retrofitted that area and that's how many they thought they could fit into that space. And so I think that is something that, as a research scientist in shelters, that's something that I hope would be considered moving forward, is that these sort of welfare sort of considerations are brought to the table during design, because I think that those small kennels, and there's different qualities of those. And so in our follow-up study that we had started and then had to stop in March due to the pandemic, we were looking at that traditional housing and just changing the size of it. So creating a size that was similar to the tradition, to that novel housing, to see, in fact, is it size that is the difference, or is there some other design feature? So I guess on that, just kind of need to stay tuned. Because hopefully we'll be able to learn more about what qualities were conferring that sort of difference between the two types of housing.
Angelique had a question about the first two studies and
Yeah.
wondered if you considered taking HRV instead of cortisol. And then for those of us that are less familiar, can you talk a little bit about HRV? Introduce what that is.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I don't know if Angelique wants to talk more about it then. Versus I can mention what I know about it. We've tried several times trying to use polar monitors to get at heart rate and heart rate variability with shelter dogs. And so far we haven't been successful in just getting some test runs up and going with the dogs where they can wear them for any like real duration of time. For example, like in the field trip study, we're looking at, somewhere like with the cortisol and the activity monitors, we're looking at 4 hours. So we haven't quite figured out a way for the dogs to be able to wear those monitors for that long of a time, 4 hours times like multiple time points. But certainly if we could include it, I think that would absolutely add to our analysis and our overall understanding of what the dogs are experiencing. I hope I did it justice. Angelique, please feel free to talk more about HRV. I think it's a great measure. We just haven't had it able to work yet.
From Jen, she writes, she's curious if the novel housing shelter has a higher adoption rate. It feels like the novel design is more pleasing from the human perspective rather than the dogs. Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, that's a good, oh, see, these are great questions. Well, so here's something interesting. It's not exactly about the adoption piece, but about that type of housing. So you have 6 different dogs that are living there together. And so the role of the person, there's an attendant that sort of is monitoring their interactions. And this piece of it, which I didn't talk about previously, is that, and this didn't happen during our study. During our study, we controlled for human contact. So other than going for walks, which we did walks with them, but even then we interacted with them minimally. But we didn't have any sort of adoption through traffic, either in the traditional kennels or that novel housing. And certainly we could look at that in future studies, but I think that certainly plays a role. And I can talk more about that based on our field trip data, but and what we found. But I think that in terms of that housing, of the novel housing where the dogs get out for a couple, throughout the day, the shelter had a really hard time staffing that position, because not only were they responsible for the care of dogs, they had to monitor the dogs' interactions, but then the public was allowed to go into that open space that you guys saw where the dogs play. So the dogs, the shelter wanted the dogs to kind of be out and mingling, not necessarily all of them, but if they could. And then if adopters were interested, they could come in and interact with the dogs while they're with other dogs. And so that's a pretty sort of skilled position to not only be able to interact with the public, interact with the dogs, and then be able to manage dog interactions with people. So I think, yes, it's definitely more appealing, I think, to the public. We oftentimes, when we were getting dogs in and out or the dogs were playing, we had many eyes on us. I think the public was interested. But I think that there are, I think it's challenging, though, to manage that space, at least in the way it was envisioned. Hopefully that answered the question.
With your first study on the sleepover dogs, did you have issues, or not issues, but did you have the pleasant surprise of a lot of those dogs being adopted out by their sleepover partners?
Oh, that's a really great question. Yeah, so that's sort of interesting, and I can talk to you a little bit about what we found. So as I mentioned before, I'm the Maddie's Fund Research Fellow at Arizona State University. So I'm overseeing the Maddie's nationwide fostering study. So for the past about 2 years or so, we have been working with shelters to launch field trip and sleepover programs, and looking at the effects of those programs on things like adoption, but also sort of determinants of success of the shelters, what qualities of the shelter make these programs successful, and volunteer and staff morale and satisfaction. But one thing we found so far in our analysis is that, dependent on whether it's field trips or sleepovers, we see somewhere of about 13 to maybe like 15% of dogs are adopted from the person that does the field trip or sleepover. So I think these programs certainly can result in dogs being adopted by the people that are doing the outing or the temporary fostering. But it's like you said, it's a pleasant surprise, but I think it's something that shelters shouldn't count on as a likely outcome for the dogs.
We have another question from Stephanie in the chat. She says, in the novel housing, was it common for some dogs to be kenneled while others were out in the open play area and directly visible to kenneled dogs? If so, did the kenneled dogs show barrier reactivity issues?
Yeah, I think you've totally, this sounds like somebody that's worked with dogs before. Yeah, I think that this was a big challenge. And if I was to design like my perfect study, what would that look like? And so perfect shelter design. I don't think I would put the interaction space in front of the kennels. I would likely put it behind, so you could access it easily without the dogs being having to watch it. Yes, and we found varied reactions with the dogs, and there were a few dogs that we ended up having to put barriers during play. And even providing them some chew or something, so they weren't barking and upset upon seeing the dogs interacting with each other. How we carried out the interaction, like I mentioned, is that we did 15-minute interactions 3 times a day. And then within those like 15-minute interactions, the timing was such that we did one group for 15 minutes and then another group for 15 minutes, and then did the next time point. And so we rotated those groups about who went first, what groups went first, and we rotated the dogs that were in those groups. But there were a few, definitely a minority, but there were a few dogs that sort of struggled with that visual piece, which is certainly, I would say, certainly a limitation of the study that unfortunately, given the design, we reduced, but we couldn't get rid of.
That's a great response, and also reminds me of my own dog. He's an Australian Shepherd, so he would definitely have an issue with any movement in front of his crate. So we have another question from Katarina. I think it's a follow-up to her earlier question. Since this is an international audience, would you be able to explain more of how shelter dogs came to be housed individually in the United States, or the why behind it? Is it because of easier manipulation for handlers? And she thanks you in advance for your explanation.
Oh, thank you. So sweet. Yeah, I mean, I think that at least from what I've been able to sort of gather, I worked in sheltering for about a decade before I came to research. And then we have all of our kind of shelter partners we work with on a regular basis. It seems to me that they kind of fall into sort of two different categories. There's sort of this like disease prevention, and they want to like reduce transmission between dogs. And then the other bit is sort of aggression between the dogs. And I think that that's something that certainly the way that shelter housing is set up here, that doesn't always allow for the dogs to be separated from things that could be challenging, like for example during feeding time. Think about that shelter that I mentioned before that we worked with. There's 6 or 8 dogs. That wasn't just one large run, and so you can imagine that there's a high probability of aggression. And I would say that shelter probably did and this is our anecdotal sort of observations during our data collection, that shelter did struggle with incidents between dogs, because I think the other thing to consider, at least in the US, is that oftentimes even if dogs are co-housed together, they're actually not given more space. So even if the dog is good with other dogs, they still have to live in a housing that was built for just one dog. Did I get all parts of that question? Was there anything left in that question?
No, I think you nailed it. I think you got all parts of it.
Okay, good.
And with that, we don't have any more questions in the chat, so I think that we'll close things out. Thank you so much for this talk. It was so informative, and I think everyone really enjoyed it. There's thank yous coming into the chat for you.
Oh, thanks.
And once again, to everybody, we will have this talk recorded, and it will be posted on the channel #webinar videos. I'll put a reminder in the general and the webinar chats as well. But thank you so much, Dr. Gunter.
Oh, thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.